Um, Thank you all for joining us. My name is Patrick Sullivan, and I am the President and CEO of the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Today, we're very excited to welcome our local airport, the Halifax Stanfield International Airport. I think that was off my script, but it is an international airport, to discuss the response to COVID-19 and their recovery plan. We all know things have changed drastically for the airport and for much of Nova Scotia. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this interesting discussion and hearing how Stanfield has managed the pandemic and what their plans are for the future. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions already for our presenter. When we get to the Q&A, please feel free to type any other questions into either the Q&A, I'm just moving my mouse here, into the Q&A, which would be the preferred method, or into the chat box. So you can put them in either spot. If you are putting them into the chat box, please address your questions to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your question, but I would encourage you to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Our guest speaker today is none other than President and CEO of the Halifax International Airport Authority, Joyce Carter. And most recently, Joyce has been, I wouldn't say nominated, awarded a top 50 CEO in Atlantic Canada. Congratulations, Joyce.
Thank you, Pat.
And well deserved. I think it's multiple wins for you. So you'll have to tell us about that at some point. We'll add that as a question. Because of Joyce's extensive knowledge and her expertise in supporting the Government of Canada during the crisis, Joyce was part of the COVID-19 Supply Council. Thank you very much for that, Joyce. I'm sure Joyce has a lot to share with us about her leadership and her time in the COVID-19 Supply Council, and I'm very anxious again to hear how Halifax Stanfield is doing in the course of our ongoing pandemic, although of course, in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada, we're in that very, very special place. So thank you very much, Joyce, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I hope that you and your families and your team members are doing well in these very challenging times. It's so great to see so many people having joined the call today. Right out of the gate, I'd like to acknowledge members of our board of directors who are in attendance on the call today, and that includes our board chair, Stephen Dempsey, so welcome to them. You may not know it, but our board members are nominated by 3 levels of government, plus by the Halifax Chamber, and also by our own organization. And that is to ensure that our board reflects the interests of our community members. Their support to our senior leadership team and to myself throughout the crisis has been very valuable, so we appreciate their time and their energy as we navigate this extraordinary challenge. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk today about how COVID-19 has affected Halifax Stanfield, and also to give you a little bit of an update on our response to the pandemic, our plans for recovery, and what all of this means for our passengers and for our partners. Earlier this month, on September 10th, we celebrated the airport's 60th anniversary. And if you had asked me back in January, if you'd said, so what do you think, Joyce, Halifax Stanfield's 60th year will look like? I would have told you that I was very optimistic about what was in store for 2020. After all, in 2019, we welcomed 4.2 million passengers, and that made it our second busiest year on record. We also processed 41,000 metric tons of cargo, so that was mostly fresh seafood headed for Asian markets. We were home to 120 organizations with 5,600 jobs here on site. And all of that contributed $3.8 billion to the provincial economy in 2018. So that's 5,600 people, ground handlers, firefighters, flight crew members, folks in aero tech and specialists, hotel clerks, security guards, you name it. This year, 2020, was truly on track to be another fantastic year of connecting our communities to the world. We couldn't have imagined that instead we would be facing one of the worst years in aviation history. We first felt the effects of the pandemic in late January, when the virus was causing significant disruption in Asia, where, as I mentioned, there's a big appetite for our Nova Scotia seafood, and in particular, our live lobster. Cargo flights from the airport dropped from an average of 7 to 8 weekly flights to Asia to just 1. We were concerned when this first occurred. It was bad timing for many Nova Scotia fishers who were opening the lobster season in Southwest Nova. Little did we know that this was the tip of the iceberg in terms of the financial hit that COVID-19 would have, not only for our airport, but for our entire province, industry, and for citizens around the world. Around the same time, Canada identified the first case of COVID-19 in Toronto. At Halifax Stanfield, we had already activated our pandemic plan. We were also working with public health and airport service delivery partners to enhance cleaning and communication around personal hygiene to limit the spread of the virus. In mid-March, the province declared a state of emergency and required anyone entering the province to self-isolate for 2 weeks. The federal government also implemented a 14-day isolation period for anyone entering Canada. Both quarantine requirements remain in place today, 6 months later. Provincial inspectors were also stationed at the airport in March to help educate travelers on the new requirements and to remind them to stay home if they experienced any COVID-19 symptoms. These inspectors remain on site at the airport today, 6 months later. I can tell you one of the strangest experiences I had as the CEO of an airport was early on in the pandemic. We were literally telling people to stay home. Stay the blazes home, to quote our premier. That was when we knew that this crisis would be unlike any other we had dealt with in the past. There were many actions we took at Halifax Stanfield even before the state of emergency was declared to prepare for what was coming. We asked employees to work from home, those who could do so. Essential workers who needed to keep working at the airport were asked to keep their distance from each other, and we staggered shifts and lunch breaks. We implemented an enhanced cleaning program. We hired additional cleaning staff to increase surface cleaning in high traffic areas. We installed more hand sanitizing stations, and we separated or removed public seating. All our efforts were to ensure that those who had to travel, whether it was to get home to their loved ones, to get to or from work, or for any essential reason, felt safe and comfortable during their journey. In response to reduced travelers, fewer bookings, and various border entry restrictions, the airlines drastically cut back flight options and service frequencies. Right now, at Halifax Stanfield, passenger flights are offered only to Air Canada, are offered only by Air Canada, WestJet, and Swoop, albeit on much reduced schedules and to fewer destinations. I was speaking to some of our Nova Scotia MPs over the last month, and I pointed out that they may have some difficulty getting to Ottawa if they need to do so for the fall session. A good example of that is this time last year, there would have been up to 10 flights departing daily to Ottawa. And right now, we're lucky if there's one. Other Canadian airlines, like Sunwing and Porter, were forced to halt operations altogether and unfortunately have not been able to resume. No American or European airlines have operated scheduled passenger services at our airport since April 1st. At our low point, there were only 5 flights each day. A member of my team said to me, "It's like the Walking Dead out there." And I thought, no kidding. To give you some perspective, here are a few key stats from 2019 for comparison. So you'll see 11,500 passengers and 200 flights a day, and 17 airlines that were connecting Halifax to 46 destinations around the world. And when you look at what routes were planned for 2020, new destinations like Munich and Manchester, compared to the reality of where we are today, it's actually a little bit shocking. The number of destinations connected to us today has been cut by 3/4. As I'm sure you can imagine, losing key services to key tourism and trade markets, such as the UK, Europe, and the US, services that we've fought hard to bring here to Halifax, to Nova Scotia, and to our region, could take years to regain, if ever. So in April and May, we served fewer passengers in each of those months than on an average day in 2019. That's 98% fewer passengers than normal. Things improved slightly in June. So in June, we saw 95% fewer passengers than the prior year. And in July, the Atlantic bubble came into effect, and we did see a marginal increase thanks to travel between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. Our passenger traffic edged up in July to 90% less than July of 2019. You might not know, but August is typically our busiest month of the year, high tourism month. And in August, we served only about 12% of the passengers that we served last year. Atlantic airports, including our own, welcomed the introduction of the Atlantic bubble as we saw it as a first good step towards easing travel restrictions into our province. The restrictions for arriving travelers in Nova Scotia and other Atlantic provinces are amongst the strictest in Canada. We were encouraged that the provinces worked together in establishing protocols that would allow for tracking travelers from outside of the bubble should COVID-19 cases increase once it was in effect. I think we've all seen that there was not a significant increase in cases in July, as both Dr. Strang and Premier McNeil have stated in their briefings. We have to learn to live with COVID-19. That means being diligent in following the advice of public health, like masking, and developing a system to test, track, and trace new cases to minimize spread. We were pleased that the province included us in a group of stakeholders, public health and immunology experts, looking to roll out a new protocol to do just that. In the meantime, we don't expect to see much improvement in passenger traffic, available flights, or revenue to sustain our operations, as long as the self-isolation requirement for travelers from outside of Atlantic Canada remains in place. Let me ask you, what business could remain open and operating with 90% less activity than normal for months on end? To understand why it's so important and why it's so significant, you have to kind of understand how our business operates. So since 2000, our airport, Halifax Stanfield, has been managed by Halifax International Airport Authority, and we're a non-share capital corporation. That means, similar to other not-for-profit organizations, any surplus at the end of a year, after we pay our rent to the federal government, is reinvested back into airport operations and provides support for ongoing facility improvements. We have three primary sources of revenue: our aeronautical revenue, which is revenue we generate directly from the airlines; non-aeronautical revenue, which comes from supporting services such as parking and airport businesses and services that are on site; and our airport improvement fees, which are charged to originating departing passengers to support our ongoing capital investments. So essentially, we operate in a user-pay system. So when very few people are traveling, the airport generates very little revenue to support our operations. If you were to come out to the airport, you would notice that there are very few cars parked in our parking lots. You hardly see any vehicles on the curb, and there are very few people in the terminal building. So this shot that you see right here was taken last week at dinner time, and there was not a soul around. Sometimes people ask me, why is the airport open at all? Or why are we allowing flights in from outside of the Atlantic bubble? I have to remind them that Halifax Stanfield is a critical piece of transportation infrastructure. It must remain open to safely move goods, essential workers, and facilitate medevac and other important services that support Canada's economy and will support the recovery. As the largest international airport in Atlantic Canada, we're open so Nova Scotians can stay connected with their loved ones. We're open so people can work outside of the province and can stay employed. And we're open so Nova Scotia business owners can serve their customers. We're also open to make sure that important supplies and deliveries from all over the world continue to flow into and out of our region. The role an airport has in supporting our region has never been more evident than during a pandemic. It was apparent as millions of masks were delivered by air from around the world into the hands of our healthcare workers. It was apparent as millions of Canadians scrambled to return home when the crisis began during spring break. But remaining open means we've had to find ways to continue paying our expenses associated with the safe operation of our airport. A sudden drop in passengers means our airport, like many other businesses, is facing critical and significant financial challenges. As part of our response to the COVID-19 situation and reduced passenger traffic, we've looked at every opportunity to increase efficiencies. Operations were consolidated in the terminal building, and early on, we shut down the north and south ends of our departure terminal, refocusing operations on the central gates. After the last flight to the US departed on April 1st, the entire US terminal closed. This is a picture of it here, and this facility remains dark and quiet today. Several escalators have been shut down to avoid operating costs and maintenance requirements. Mobile kiosks and parts of the check-in hall were powered down, and lights were dimmed where possible. We've closed some of our parking lots, including the park and fly lot. We've closed an employee parking lot, and we've closed 3 levels of our parkade. And that allows us to reduce lighting and decrease operational costs. Unfortunately, these cost reductions were insufficient, and we were also faced with reducing our workforce. Airport activity is going to look different in the coming years, and therefore our organization has to look different too. At the end of this year, we will have reduced the number of employees working at HIAA by approximately 25%. And we sincerely do regret having to do layoffs. Our people are a big part of the reason that we are consistently recognized amongst the best airports of our size in the world. So it's been a really tough time for our entire team. And it's not just HIAA that has been affected. Our airline partners are also bearing the brunt of this pandemic. WestJet closed their local Halifax station, meaning WestJet flights are now serviced with contracted staff, not their own employees, cutting jobs in our local industry. Jazz also announced significant job cuts, and Porter Airlines hasn't operated any flights since the pandemic began. Air Transat recently announced another round of layoffs, and Air Canada was forced to cut most interregional service indefinitely, such as service from Halifax to Moncton and Halifax to Charlottetown. This has a ripple effect on airport employees, airport businesses, and service providers who have been greatly impacted by the sudden and significant disruption in air travel. 90% of the businesses inside the airport's terminal building remain closed and may not be able to open for years, if ever, due to the lack of passenger demand. Our supply chain partners have also been affected. For example, Lunenburg-based Stelia, which manufactures aircraft parts for companies like Bombardier and Boeing, has had to lay off 20% of its employees and put one of its assembly plants on the market. We're predicting an overall 50% reduction in aviation industry jobs across Canada, and many more in the tourism sector, which relies on air links. 50%, that's unimaginable. One example is the hotels located around the airport and of course throughout the city, which are operating at 20 to 25% occupancy and have had to lay off many employees. So unfortunately, without government leadership and action, these jobs will not come back. The ongoing impact of COVID-19 on our industry as a whole is extraordinary, and our hearts go out to everyone impacted by this pandemic, both personally and professionally. All of this said, the pandemic will undoubtedly have a significant negative impact not only on the economy, but also on the cost of air travel and our ability to efficiently reconnect our loved ones, businesses, and educational institutions. To prepare for the new reality of air travel and to do our part to minimize the impact, we created a recovery task force to determine what we'll need to do to sustain our operations and support our passengers and our airport partners going forward. Our task force is led by Paul Baxter. He's our Senior Vice President of Operations and our Chief Commercial Officer. And its mandate is to produce a plan that will guide how we rebuild passenger confidence and revenue while managing evolving operational and human resource requirements. It's not an easy task. After all, there continues to be considerable uncertainty about the pandemic's path and how government and the economy will respond. In the meantime, it's important for us to assess and understand our passenger recovery and how the industry will change in terms of regulations, technologies, and passenger processing models. As we see it, there's three main factors impacting our industry's recovery: federal and provincial border restrictions, travel advisories, and quarantine measures; the financial viability of the industry, so airlines, airport businesses, and airport authorities; and the third being consumer confidence in air travel. And speaking of consumer confidence, in June, we conducted a passenger expectations survey, and 3/4 of respondents told us they wanted physical distancing, increased hand sanitizer, and enhanced cleaning to be our priority. We were glad to see 86% of respondents felt that we would take the necessary precautions to help ensure health and safety. Our Stay Healthy campaign, which includes print and digital signage, as well as a social media component, has been an important part of our recovery efforts, and it helps us clearly communicate new health and safety protocols to passengers, workers, and visitors. Instilling passenger confidence will be essential to bolstering the return to air travel as restrictions are eased. Regular and transparent communications about what's happening at the airport has been a big focus of us throughout the pandemic. We want to ensure our passengers, our airport workers, and our stakeholders are aware of and follow the numerous measures we've taken to create a health and safety environment for all. We were very pleased to learn late last week that we have been accredited in the Airports Council International Airport Health Accreditation Program. This is a new program created to recognize airports who are providing a safe airport experience for all travelers and have introduced recommended global health measures and industry best practices. Airports will continue to change processes and to implement solutions that increase passenger confidence that flying can be done safely. For example, we expect to see an increase in the use of self-serve or touchless technology to reduce unnecessary person-to-person interactions. We're well positioned here at Halifax Stanfield already with our self-serve bag drop system and check-in kiosk system that's available throughout the airport. We may also see future adjustments to terminal infrastructure, such as different types of seating or food and beverage service delivery to allow for physical distancing. We also expect that some form of permanent health check facilities will be required for both inbound and outbound passengers. Airports may act as a health filter, so to speak, to ensure passengers on aircraft aren't putting others at risk of getting sick. The Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, or CATSA as we know them, has already began implementing temperature checks at the country's 4 largest airports, and this process will come to Halifax Stanfield starting tomorrow. Here's an example of what this looks like, and this photo you're seeing on your screen was taken at the Calgary airport. It's conceivable that pre-board health checks may become a permanent feature in air travel, much like pre-board security screening measures that were permanently heightened after the September 11th terrorist attacks. As airports and airlines are adjusting to the complexities of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is essential that Halifax Stanfield be part of a harmonized and consistent approach to move towards recovery and growth in the post-pandemic world. So that's the future, but right now, we feel a little bit like we're on the longest layover of life. Travel restrictions for visitors and residents arriving from outside the Atlantic bubble remain in place, and the border to the US remains closed. Public sentiment in Atlantic Canada remains particularly negative in relation to travel outside of the bubble. Recent surveys by local company Narrative Research suggest Nova Scotians are among the least likely to want to travel even within Canada and have the strongest opposition to reopening our borders. Half of Nova Scotian respondents in a July survey by Destination Canada said no combination of traveler incentives or discounts would inspire them to book air travel in the near future. And this is after the bubble opened and cases didn't spike. And this is after we've seen the very low infection rates of arriving university students who were tested throughout their isolation. Given the impact of the dramatic reduction in passenger levels and the expected slow recovery, we're estimating that it will be 2024 before we here reach 2019 passenger levels and then begin to move into growth mode. We fully expect that as this complex situation evolves over the coming months and years, so too will our recovery planning. One bright spot for us here at Halifax Stanfield throughout the pandemic has been the construction of the Air Cargo Logistics Park, and that has continued, and it's still on track to be completed in the spring of 2021. Funding for this project has come from the federal and provincial governments and from HIAA. If you drive by the airport today, you'll see a significant amount of concrete that is being poured and building construction has started. We were pleased that 2019 was a record year for cargo and our 6th straight year of cargo growth. The Air Cargo Logistics Park, when complete, will continue to facilitate the efficient flow of goods and demonstrate the efficient role and essential role that airports play in our region's economy and in our transportation network. As the government looks ahead to economic recovery for COVID-19, health and safety remain top of mind at Halifax Stanfield and our airports across the country. I've been fortunate that as chair of the Canadian Airports Council, I've been very close to this situation and I've been engaged with government and stakeholders at both the local and the national levels. We're pleased with an early announcement that Transport Canada would provide ground lease rent for 22 Canadian airports, and that includes Halifax, from March to December of this year. That was a very good first step. As you may know, HIAA has a long-term land lease to manage, operate, and develop the airport, and that agreement includes paying rent to Transport Canada. And in fact, we've paid almost $100 million in rent to the feds since we began managing the airport in the year 2000. The rent is directly proportionate to the amount of revenue we generate. So with dramatically reduced revenue coming in this year, this announcement unfortunately has provided us with limited relief. This, along with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, while appreciated, has been of limited benefit given the magnitude of our revenue loss. The prolonged suppression of passenger traffic and revenues only increases our need for financial help. Without support now, airports like ours will be faced and will be forced to raise fees to travelers, to reduce operations, to cut more jobs, and to take other drastic actions at a time when we should be focused on and planning for our recovery. We want to support you. We want to help you connect with your loved ones and with your colleagues and with your clients. Whenever you're ready, we're ready to help you along all aspects of your journey. But it goes without saying, there will be fewer flights to fewer destinations, and there'll be less options for services at the airport when you're waiting for your flight. Without support for our industry, it could take years to come back what has been lost by so many. And we're not asking for a handout. We've asked the government to work with us on reasonable solutions. In particular, we're asking for immediate financial support for Canada's airports. Though the immediate future remains difficult for all of us, with this support, Halifax Stanfield can play a key role in driving economic recovery in Nova Scotia and in the entire Atlantic region. Our airport has gone through a significant transformation over its 60-year history. From the way you arrive, to the way you check in, to the way you go through security, how you board your airplane, every part of your journey has changed over time. And that's been in response to technology and also in response to world events. Today, the airport provides an essential transportation link for the safe and efficient movement of people and goods across our region. This purpose is extremely evident as we navigate COVID-19, one of the most difficult situations we have ever faced. From my perspective, the pandemic has by far been the most impactful on our people, on our businesses, on our industry, and on our community. Over the 20 years that HIAA has managed, operated, and developed Halifax Stanfield, we've grown and established ourselves as an important contributor to the region, one that we can be very proud to serve. It's for this reason that I'm confident we'll get through this extremely challenging time and be ready to serve again when the time is right. I hope we can count on your support as we all learn how to live and to work in our new reality. I encourage you to raise this issue with your provincial and federal representatives. Tell them you're concerned that Canada's airports won't be there to support you, your family, or your businesses when you need it. When you're talking with your family or your neighbors or your colleagues, tell them what you've heard today, that aviation, like every other industry, has your health and your safety top of mind. And we're doing everything we can to adapt and enhance the traveler journey in our new reality. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Really appreciate that. Although I must admit, it's not a great story right now. And when I look at the economic impact that the airport has on the province of Nova Scotia, when I look at the 5,600 jobs that happen, I think you described to me before that the airport is one of the largest municipalities, if we think of it that way, in the province of Nova Scotia, with over 5,600 people sort of going there each day or night. So it's clearly a worry. You've had some support from the federal government to this point. Are you looking forward to the speech from the throne tomorrow? And do you think there'll be any answers there at this point?
So we are looking forward to the speech from the throne tomorrow, for sure. And we're going to be paying attention to every word, Pat. So as you've pointed out, airports are significant economic contributors to the economy. Not only in Nova Scotia, every airport in its community plays a significant role in all aspects: tourism, trade, immigration, foreign investment, all of that. And so these airports need to be here, and they need to be financially viable as we recover from the pandemic. And so the support that we have received to date, as I mentioned, the two in particular, ground lease rent, which has been of limited help because no revenue means no rent in any case. So I think it was announced as a $300 million package. It is obviously many times smaller than that because of the limited revenue. But the other piece of support for airports, or some airports, Halifax was one of them, has been the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. And that as well has been helpful. We're grateful for it, but limited support. We absolutely need to have sectorial support for the aviation business. And so we're hoping tomorrow that we hear some indication of sectorial support, but we certainly are continuing all of the advocacy work that we do and have done with all of our industry colleagues, all of our government officials, our MPs. We've spoken to every one of them to ensure that that message is making it to the key folks who need to hear the message. I mean, let's be clear, the health and safety of our passengers, of ourselves, of our community is the top priority. The economic piece needs to come hand in hand with that. We can do both, we feel, with the right level of support. And so we've asked for the extension of ground lease rent beyond the period that it's been granted now, so beyond 2020. And we've also asked for help with respect to loans to the industry that would be interest free and that would be repaid based on a schedule with economic recovery. So those are the two asks we have before the government today. And we're very hopeful that we see some sectorial support, not only for airports, to be honest, but for the entire sector. We need to have our airline partners here to support travel out of the region in the future. The cuts that I mentioned that have been made because they have been needed to be made.
Ross has asked a question, so I'll repeat that. It's he thanks you for the leadership at this difficult time. It recognize the impacts of the pandemic and the harm the virus can pose. But what would you see as the top opportunities you see for recovery, and what can businesses on this call, or government on this call, or members of the chamber, what can we do to help Halifax Stanfield and other airports across the province, I suppose, the one other airport across the province?
Yeah. Thank you, Ross. I think I probably know which Ross this is, so that's a great question. And it's funny because the strategic advantages that we have here as an airport, as a region that we've built upon over the last many years will continue to be the advantages that take us out of the pandemic. So when you look at the service that we've had, Halifax Stanfield has become a hub in the region, but also a hub in Canada. And so it has allowed us to grow our traffic exponentially to areas in Europe, as an example, which has been a huge advantage for us as it relates to tourism growth. That advantage is still there. You know, somebody said to me recently at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone has forgotten about the 737 MAX issue. The 737 MAX is an aircraft that is extremely important to us in this region, and that will fly again and will fly again soon. And so it will continue to be available. And the biggest challenge we had going into the pandemic is a lack of available aircraft. We don't have that anymore. So we can continue to support our tourism sector in its regrowth. Domestically first, there's no question with the pandemic that people are going to want to fly domestically first once our Atlantic bubble opens up, and then internationally based on all the strategic advantages that we've had to date. And so for sure, that is going to be a big advantage for us going forward. When I think about, you know, what folks on the call can do, I spoke about some of that at the very end of my remarks, is continue to tell the story of Halifax Stanfield. I had someone say to me recently, well, you know, nothing's happening, so I'm sure everything's okay at the airport. No one's flying, so just kind of wait it out. That is very difficult to do when you run an infrastructure the size of ours that prior to the pandemic would generate revenue of over $100 million annually to help support the infrastructure that we have to support here. Without any passengers in a user-pay system, we have no revenue. And so we need to continue to figure out ways to generate revenue. But in the interim, we absolutely need the support from the government to get us through the period. We're still in the crisis. We're not out of it yet, right? So get us through this crisis period. And then as we start the recovery and the growth to help build those passengers back up again. So tell the story, travel when you feel safe to do so. Know that we're here to support you through that journey. Certainly, we pay very close attention to the protocols, talk to the government about common protocols across the country. This is something that's been really important to us from the very beginning. So when you look at health and safety measures at the various airports across Canada, the public health measures need to be consistent so you as a passenger feel the same level of experience at each airport in Canada, whether you're arriving or departing. And we've had a good example of that, the temperature screening that I mentioned that's starting here at Halifax tomorrow.
Great. I have Trevor asking, how can local companies arrange a presentation with your team as it relates to innovative COVID-19 solutions and reducing the cost of your facility management? I expect you'd be keen.
No, for sure. So that's, I mean, very much so the same way we've always done. We still continue business in our normal way. So certainly I know I have Tiffany Chase on the line and a number of members of our team. So certainly reach out to us directly if there's innovative processes. We're looking at not only what's being done locally, but certainly what's being done in Canada and what's being done around the world. And I'm very pleased to be participating with the province as well. The province plays a big role in this. And so I mentioned in my remarks about participating them in a test, track, and trace initiative. Very important work being done there that we would like to partner, certainly with the province and with others on. So please reach out to myself directly or to any member on a team. All of our information is on our website.
Great. Okay, thank you, Joyce. So, you know, you're touching on, and clearly the 14-day quarantine in Atlantic Canada has some impact. You know, I'm trying not to let my biases show, but as someone who's been in quarantine for 14 days, and my wife who's actually been in quarantine now twice, 28 days for 2 trips to Toronto to visit her 88-year-old mother, maybe my bias is starting to show already. You know, and the fact that Ontario has, although significantly more cases than it had in the past, they're now at 1 in 35,000 people who have COVID on a new case basis. Is the 14-day quarantine affecting Halifax more than it's affecting other airports, given that there's no quarantine in 7 other provinces in Canada?
Good question, Pat. So certainly it is. One of the things that I'm able to do is look at the recovery. I call it the recovery, but as I mentioned, we're still in the crisis. But look at how other airports, and in particular airports whose passenger profile matches Halifax's profile the most, and look at how they are able to rebuild their passenger base relative to Halifax and compare the measures and the pandemic in comparison to that, in comparison to Halifax. So we would have some of the strictest measures, there's no question in Nova Scotia, we would have some of the strictest measures in the country with the requirement for a 14-day quarantine that applies not only to visitors to our province, but also applies to residents, as you just mentioned. So some folks aren't aware of that as a resident, if you want to do business travel and have a meeting with somebody in another city, you're required to quarantine upon your return. And so what we're seeing when we look at the difference in traffic, as I mentioned, some of the numbers in my presentation, we saw 12% of our passenger normal volumes in the month of August. That is higher by anywhere between 10 and 15%. So an additional 10 to 15% in cities that don't have the 14-day quarantine. So it's certainly not a savior, but when you're down and only seeing 10% of your traffic and you can double that to 20, financially, that makes a difference. And so certainly it is impacting the travel numbers through the airport that we're seeing in Nova Scotia.
Joyce, Peter has asked, what do you attribute Nova Scotia's population's reluctance to air travel more than other Canadians?
Well, it's a good question. I mentioned this on a presentation I did recently. Is certainly, our messaging around staying home and our messaging around the requirement to control the virus and to flatten the curve was extremely well done by the province and was done for all of the right reasons. And we became a province fairly quickly without very many cases. And so our Premier and Dr. Strang did a great job for the right reasons and at the right time with scaring people to stay home. It's become, in my view, a little bit in Nova Scotia now difficult to unscare them. And so how do we instill confidence, to get people back out, not just flying, but back out serving going to our restaurants, doing activities in the city. And I think because we have the bubble in place now, Pat, and we talk about living with COVID, because the bubble has basically, what are we now, 14 days, 15 days with no cases, has kind of taught us that that is a good thing, and it is absolutely a good thing, but has also made it harder to understand what living with COVID really means. So describing how we can live with COVID and how we can replace the 14-day quarantine with other measures isn't getting a whole lot of traction, because people can only see that the quarantine, and it's a very effective health measure for sure, is the only way to reduce the numbers. And so I really applaud our government for working on the testing, tracking, and tracing initiatives that they are. And the quicker we're able to get those in place and learn, I'm sure we have great data from the students, the 3 testing these students did, the quicker we're able to do that and have this information available for us, then I firmly do believe that the quicker that we're going to be able to start to lift, maybe not all the restrictions around the quarantine, but some of the restrictions around the quarantine, that we're going to replace it with something that is better, that then helps us live with COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, I will state my biases now, I suppose. I have been an advocate to open the bubble. I will not say that that's not an opinion shared by all of my board members. So I'm going out on a limb here by saying that. But Nova Scotia does have some of the strictest requirements in terms of Nova Scotia is the only province in the Atlantic bubble that has mask wearing as a requirement. There's one example. We still have the 2-meter physical distancing. In New Brunswick, if you're a worker in New Brunswick and you work in Alberta, you can fly to Alberta and you can fly home and not quarantine when you get back. So there's a number of holes, if you will, in the bubble already. And I would really question, I'd like our audience, I won't ask you this, Joyce, but I'll ask our audience to reflect the next time they're listening to the news, how much spread is there from one province to another, and how much community spread is there inside a province? And I think what you'll find is the community spread is taking place inside the province. It's not happening from travel. And one last thing, sorry, Joyce, I don't want to take over here, but air travel is safe. Maybe I'll ask you this question. You speak to Air Canada, you speak to WestJet, I'm sure you're speaking to Porter as well. What are they saying about how safe air travel is when you get on a plane?
So one message that's not getting out well in Canada is that there have been no known cases of COVID transmitted on a domestic flight in Canada or at an airport in Canada. And that message seems a little self-serving for airports and air carriers to be saying, but it is in fact true. So when you hear in the paper or on the news, a flight that came to Halifax from Calgary had a case of somebody who later tested positive for COVID, that was the case of an asymptomatic passenger who would have gone through the tests he did or she did at the airport, boarded the flight, felt fine, and several days later presented with symptoms of COVID. But there has been no cases of transmission from those passengers taking place in Canada, domestic flights or domestic airports. And IATA, who's the International Aviation Transport Association, has looked at this around the world, and it is surprisingly low, even on international flights. I don't want to quote the number because I'll get it wrong, but it's less than a handful around the world that has been shown to have been transmitted on the aircraft. So of course, what's happening is those who do travel are picking up the virus in the market they're in, and then not realizing till they got home that they had COVID, and obviously it then becomes identified as a case related to travel.
Right. But then they don't get back to us and say there's been no cases on the plane. Sadly, we just hear it was on WestJet or Air Canada. And then we never hear that there was no transmission on the plane, which I absolutely agree with. So a question from Paul. It's a bit lengthy, Paul, so I'm just gonna go right to the question, which is how can we implement contactless travel when needed, and how much can IT and artificial intelligence restructuring at the airport move Halifax Stanfield into a world where pandemics are potentially ongoing, sadly, as we go through the next decade or two or half century or whatever it is.
Yeah, there's no question contactless travel is the way of the future. And so one of the things I often reflect back upon, I mentioned in my remarks how much the airport and travel has changed due to all kinds of events, some being technology. Changes in technology, it's, if someone were to say, what will be a good thing that will come out of this pandemic, is it is going to bolster forward the change that you're going to see in the processes at airports, I truly believe, as it relates to technology. Lots of good initiatives were in place prior to the pandemic. However, many of them get stalled in the many sort of regulatory steps you have to go through. Certainly, the industry now has talked and will continue to talk and will continue to implement some great touchless processes through airports. I often have this idea, pre-pandemic, when you think about what travel will look like in the future, it is all basically touchless. And so when you think about the days when you used to be able to walk through the airport without really feeling any of the processes you're going through, when you think about biometrics and how that might change your process going forward, I think you're going to see some significant changes. And the pandemic has only enhanced the importance of making that process touchless. People will feel more comfortable, they'll feel more supported, they'll understand why it needs to be done. And I think once that traveler confidence starts to rebuild, then we will regain. I do feel very confident that we will regain our traffic. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take a lot of hard work and support and great initiatives like the question that I was just asked.
Another question, or maybe it's more of a comment from Raider 2020. Are you, Joyce, or am I, Patrick, receiving any feedback on reduced business development opportunities of business or potential closures? As a business development exec who works in global aviation, he or she have experienced a 90% decline over 2019 without access to even Canadian central and western markets, without a 14-day quarantine. His business will be closing. So I guess it's more of a statement. We kind of addressed the bubble. We are seeing, places like Heathrow have introduced a testing facility, although, as I understand it, it's not yet approved. But there is a testing facility where you can get a test and you may be released from quarantine early, or you can get your results almost immediately and be free to go without a 14-day quarantine. Is that something that Stanfield is considering?
So I have to say, until there is a vaccine in place that's widely available and distributed, what I really do believe is testing is the way of the future. And so we absolutely have been working with our industry partners, federally and provincially, to look at options at Halifax Stanfield as it relates to testing. We definitely can't do this on our own. Significant involvement from public health. Right now within Canada, there are no approved rapid tests that you could take at airports. But certainly what you're seeing around the world, you've mentioned Heathrow as a good example. Pat, they're not the only one, is as part of your travel journey, there is testing at some point. And I truly do believe you're going to see it. The provinces are very interested in seeing it upon arrival because they want to know who's arriving and do they have COVID. But you're also going to see it, in my view, integrated into departures because the whole system wants to know that those who are traveling are not traveling with COVID or with, frankly, any communicable disease. So testing is going to be key for us. And certainly we have spent a lot of time talking about how this can be done consistently and how it can be done nationally. And you may have read there's 2 pilots going on right now, one at GTAA. I believe GTAA's pilot is with Air Canada, and it is on arriving passengers. And the second pilot that's happening right now is at YVR, and that is in partnership with, of course, both cases, public health, but YVR's is in partnership with WestJet, and that is on departing passengers. So you're going to see some big changes in this in the industry through the time until, and I think forever, we have a vaccine for this particular virus.
Well, the province of Nova Scotia recently received, or announced last week, they received $140 million from the federal government that is theoretically supposed to be spent in the next 6 months. And if there's anybody from government on the line, I'd encourage you to send some of that money to Joyce for two reasons. One, to begin testing. And I guess as a follow-up question, Joyce, is there you've talked about the federal government. Is there a hope that the provincial government will be assisting the airport as well with funding?
So there is. And so when you think about the testing on arrivals, for sure, that's going to be mostly driven by the province. And as I mentioned, Patrick, earlier, there is a fair amount of work happening in this area right now on testing, tracking, and tracing, exactly how that's going to work. And I know the province is interested in having that supplement the quarantine. I don't mean to say in addition to, but to get the same conditions and results that we do from the quarantine by testing, tracking, and tracing. And so this obviously is not inexpensive. This is something that needs to be led by public health. And certainly you mentioned the funding that is in place. It would be absolutely wonderful to see them designate some of that funding for this purpose. And I'm very hopeful that they will.
So a quick final question, Joyce, I guess, and that's tourism. Normally we have over 2 million people visit us a year, or sorry, travel in the Maritimes a year. Not all of them obviously come through the airport, but a significant portion do come through the airport. You know, is there a hope that domestic tourism at least will be back next year as we head into 2021?
There's a hope for sure. So domestic tourism is also a big part of our tourism. Obviously, international is as well. And so when you look into 2021, I know, you know, we've certainly lost the summer and the fall season for tourism in Nova Scotia. That's devastating for their industry. That's devastating for the tourism operators. I worry a lot about these operators being able to survive through the winter season. But certainly domestically, with the opening of the borders and the provincial borders and the testing and tracking I'm very hopeful for not only domestic tourism rebounding as soon as that takes place. There's a pent-up demand. People want to come to Nova Scotia, but also on the international side, Pat. So obviously we need the international borders to be open. I want to remind folks on the call that with the exception of the US, the only airports today that are allowed to receive international flights, and this is a federal requirement, is Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. So Halifax can't receive them. When those restrictions are lifted, I feel very confident that in addition to the protocols and testing that the province is looking at doing, that we will be able to rebound tourism. It'll take some time, and I fear that our tourist operators are going to be so significantly hit that they won't be there. But we certainly do feel optimistic about both the domestic and the international in 2021.
Well, I think we are, you know, as we talked right at the beginning, we are in a special place in Nova Scotia right now. Nova Scotia has the lowest cases of COVID in all of North America, other than Nunavut. So I'm not going to, you know, discount Nunavut, but the lowest cases of COVID. We are in a special, unique place. I think, to your point, there is pent-up demand to get to a place that doesn't have cases of COVID. And if there's a way to test and track, you know, at the airport, I think that would be a key opportunity. And again, you know, let's take some of that money, and there has not been a lot of money from the provincial government. I will state this right up front, that has been directed to the tourism industry as of yet. There needs to be funds for that industry, which is suffering significantly right now. And there needs to be funds directed to that industry to prepare us for next year and encourage people to come to Nova Scotia. I'm going to cut it off there, Joyce. I really enjoyed the conversation. I could go on for another hour, given that I have an 88-year-old mother-in-law in Toronto and a 34-year-old son in London, England, who I would love to go visit with my grandson. So I'm keen to travel again. My wife has traveled, and we will be visiting the airport very soon. Sadly, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Joyce, for your great presentation. Very, very informative, really helpful. I would encourage people to listen. As Joyce said, contact your MLA, contact your MP, let people know what you think about support for the airport and what a critical piece of infrastructure the airport is, and the 5,600 jobs that are at the airport. What can we do to get those people back to work? If you're looking to get involved with the Chamber, sponsorship is a special way for our members to support us. We're looking for new webinars. If you have another idea for a webinar, please let us know. We will be having a power lunch tomorrow, and on Thursday, I know we've got another great event on Thursday, and I should remember what it is, but another great webinar on Thursday, and you should take a look at our event calendar to look at that. This webinar will be recorded and available on YouTube for you to take a look at. Thank you very much, Joyce and Tiffany and Sandra, for helping to put this together, and look forward to seeing you again live and in person, Joyce.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you to all the folks who tuned in today, and stay safe through the hurricane.
Thank you.
Best of luck. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.